LBC Radio presents episode 2 of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Before we begin, here's a word from our scriptwriter, Noah Lynch.
Good evening, LBC students, friends, and faculty. No doubt you have heard of the story, known as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, before. Perhaps in the form of the musical Jekyll and Hyde, or any one of the movies made from Robert Louis Stevenson's original book. However, like many stories, the true tale has been changed in such a way that many key details have been obscured or omitted in other retellings. Last week, we began our live radio performance of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, true to the context of the original story, and performed by our own LBC student actors. We left the first part of our story with Mr. Utterson and his kin, Miss Enfield, having an odd encounter with Dr. Jekyll. And now, we enter the next chapter of this strange and sad tale.
Chapter 8. The Last Night. Mr. Utterson was sitting by his fireside one evening after dinner, when he was surprised to receive a visit from Poole.
Bless me, Poole, what brings you here? What ails you? Is the doctor ill?
Mr. Utterson, there is something wrong.
Take a seat, and here is a glass of wine for you. Now, take your time and tell me plainly what you want.
You know the doctor's ways, sir, and how he shuts himself up. Well, he's shut up again in the cabinet, and I don't like it, sir. I wish I may die if I like it. Mr. Utterson, sir, I'm afraid.
Now, my good woman, be explicit. What are you afraid of?
I've been afraid for about a week, and I can bear it no more.
The woman's appearance amply bore out her words. Her manner was altered for the worse, and except for the moment when she had first announced her terror, she had not once looked the lawyer in the face.
I can bear it no more.
Come, I see you have some good reason, Poole. I see there is something seriously amiss. Try to tell me what it is.
I think there's been foul play.
Foul play? What foul play? What do you mean, Poole?
I daren't say, sir, but will you come along with me and see for yourself?
Mr. Utterson's only answer was to rise and get his hat and greatcoat. As they approached Jekyll's house, Poole now pulled up in the middle of the pavement, and in spite of the biting weather, took off her hat and mopped her brow with a red pocket handkerchief. But for all the hurry of her coming, these were not the dews of exertion that she wiped away, but the moisture of some strangling anguish, for her face was white and her voice, when she spoke, harsh and broken.
Well, sir, here we are, and God grant there be nothing wrong.
Amen, Poole.
Thereupon the servant knocked in a very guarded manner. The door was opened on the chain, and a voice asked from within,
"Is that you, Poole?"
It's all right. Open the door.
The hall, when they entered it, was brightly lighted up. The fire was built high, and about the hearth the whole of the servants, men and women, stood huddled together like a flock of sheep. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, the housemaid broke into hysterical whimpering, and the cook cried out,
"Bless God! It's Mr. Utterson!"
What? Are you all here? Very irregular, very unseemly. Your master would be far from pleased.
They're all afraid.
Blank silence followed, no one protesting. Only the maid lifted up her voice and now wept loudly.
Hold your tongue.
Her ferocity of accent testified to her own jangled nerves, and indeed, when the girl had so suddenly raised the note of her lamentation, they had all started and turned toward the inner door with faces of dreadful expectation.
Knife boy, reach me a candle, and we'll deal with this at once. Now, Mr. Utterson, you come as gently as you can. I want you to hear, and I don't want you to be heard. And see here, sir, if you by any chance he was to ask you in, don't go.
Mr. Utterson's nerves, at this unlocked-for termination, gave a jerk that nearly threw him from his balance. But he recollected his courage and followed the butler into the laboratory building. Here, Poole motioned him to stand on one side and listen, while she herself, setting down the candle and making a great and obvious call on her resolution, mounted the steps and knocked with a somewhat uncertain hand on the cabinet door.
Mr. Utterson, sir, is asking to see you.
Tell him I cannot see anyone.
Thank you, sir.
Taking up her candle, she led Mr. Utterson back across the yard and into the kitchen.
Sir, was that my master's voice?
It seems much changed.
Changed? Well, yes, I think so. Have I been 20 years in this man's house to be deceived by his voice? No, sir, master's made away with. He was made away with 8 days ago when we heard him cry out upon the name of God. And who's in there instead of him, and why it stays there, is a thing that cries to heaven, Mr. Utterson.
This is a very strange tale, Poole. Supposing Dr. Jekyll to have been, well, murdered, what could induce the murderer to stay? That won't hold water. It doesn't commend itself to reason.
Well, Mr. Utterson, you are a hard man to satisfy, but I'll do it yet. All this last week, you must know, him or it or whatever it is that lives in that cabinet has been crying night and day for some sort of medicine and cannot get it to his mind. It was sometimes his way, the master's that is, to write his orders on a sheet of paper and throw it on the stair. We've had nothing else this week back, nothing but papers and a closed door, and the very meals left there to be smuggled in when nobody was looking. Well, sir, every day, aye, and twice and thrice in the same day, there have been orders and complaints, and I have been sent flying to all of the wholesale chemists in town. Every time I brought the stuff back, there would be another paper telling me to return it, because it was not pure, and another order to a different firm. This drug is wanted bitter bad, sir, whatever for.
Have you any of these papers?
Poole felt in her pocket and handed out a crumpled note, which the lawyer, bending near to the candle, carefully examined. Its contents ran thus. Dr. Jekyll presents his compliments to Messrs. Moore. He assures them that the last sample is impure and quite useless for his present purpose. In the year 1886, Dr. J purchased a somewhat large quantity from Messrs. M. He now begs them to search with the most sedulous care, and should any of the same quality be left, to forward it to him at once. Expense is no consideration. The importance of this to Dr. J can hardly be exaggerated. So far, the letter had run composedly enough, but here, with a sudden splutter of the pen, the writer's emotion had broken loose. "For God's sakes," he added, "find me some of the old."
This is a strange note. How do you come to have it open?
The man at Moz was proper angry, sir, and he threw it back to me like dirt.
And this is unquestionably the doctor's hand. Do you know?
I thought it looked like it. But what does the hand of right matter? I've seen him.
Seen him? Well?
That's it. It was this way. I came suddenly into the theatre from the garden. It seems he had slipped out to look for this drug or whatever it is, for the cabinet door was open. And there he was at the far end of the room digging among the crates. He looked up when I came in, gave a kind of cry, and whipped upstairs into the cabinet. It was but for 1 minute that I saw him, but the hair stood upon my head like quills. Sir, if that was my master, why had he a mask upon his face? If it was my master, why did he cry out like a rat and run from me? I have served him long enough, and then...
These are all very strange circumstances, but I think I'm beginning to see daylight. Your master, Poole, is plainly seized with one of those maladies that both torture and deform the sufferer. Hence, for aught I know, the alteration of his voice, hence the mask and the avoidance of his friends, hence his eagerness to find this drug, by means of which the poor soul retains some hope of ultimate recovery. God grant that he not be deceived. There is my explanation. It is sad enough, Poole, and appalling to consider, but it is plain and natural, hangs well together, and delivers us from all exorbitant alarms.
Sir, that thing was not my master, and there's the truth. My master is a tall, fine build of a man, and this was more of a dwarf.
Poole...
Oh, sir, do you think I do not know my master after 20 years? Do you think I do not know where his head comes to the cabinet door? Where I saw him every morning of my life? No, sir, that thing in the mask was never Dr. Jekyll. God knows what it was, but it was never Dr. Jekyll. And it is the belief of my heart that there was murder done.
Poole, if you say that, it will become my duty to make certain. Much as I desire to spare your master's feelings, much as I am puzzled by this note which seems to prove him to still be alive, I shall consider it my duty to break into that door.
Ah, Mr. Utterson, that's talking.
And now comes the second question. Who is going to do it?
Why, you and me, of course.
That's very well said, and whatever comes of it, I shall make it my business to see you are no loser.
There is an axe in the theatre, and you might take the kitchen poker for yourself.
Do you know, Poole, that you and I are about to place ourselves in a position of some peril?
You may say so, sir, indeed.
It is well, then, that we should be frank. We both think more than we have said. Let us make a clean slate. This masked figure that you saw, did you recognize it?
Well, sir, it went so quick, and the creature was so doubled up, that I could hardly swear to that. But if you mean, was it Mr. Hyde? Why, yes, I think it was. You see, it was much of the same bigness, and it had the same quick, light way with it. And then who else could have gone in by the laboratory door? You have not forgotten, sir, that at the time of the murder, he still had the key with him. But that's not all. I don't know, Mr. Utterson, if you've ever met this Mr. Hyde?
Unfortunately, yes, I once spoke with him.
Then you must know, as well as the rest of us, that there was something unusual about that gentleman. Something disturbing. I don't know rightly how to say it, sir, beyond this, that you felt it in your bones, kind of cold and thin.
I agree. I felt something of what you describe.
Quite so, sir. Well, when that masked thing jumped up like a monkey from among the chemicals and whipped into the cabinet, it went down my spine like ice. Oh, I know it's not evidence, Mr. Utterson. I'm book-learned enough for that. But a woman has her feelings, and I give you my Bible word it was Mr. Hyde.
Aye. My fears incline to the same point. Evil, I fear, founded evil was sure to come of that connection. Aye, truly I believe you. I believe poor Henry is killed, and I believe his murderer, for what purpose God alone can tell, is still lurking in his victim's room. Well, let our name be Vengeance. Call Bradshaw.
The footman came at the summons, very white and very nervous.
Pull yourself together, Bradshaw. This suspense, I know, is telling upon all of us, but it is now our intention to make an end of it. Poole and I are going to force our way into the cabinet. If all is well, my shoulders are broad enough to bear the blame. Meanwhile, lest anything should really be amiss, or any criminal seek to escape by the back, you, Bradshaw, and the knife boy must go around the corner with a pair of good sticks and take your post at the laboratory door. We'll give you 10 minutes to get to your stations.
As Bradshaw and the knife boy left, the lawyer looked at his watch.
And now, Poole, let us get to our station.
And Utterson, taking the kitchen poker under his arm, led the way into the yard. It was now quite dark. They came into the shelter of the laboratory, where they sat down silently to wait. London hummed solemnly all around, but nearer at hand, the stillness was only broken by the sounds of a footfall moving to and fro along the cabinet floor.
So, the feet will walk all day, sir, aye, in the better part of the night. Only when a new sample comes from the chemist there's a bit of a break. It's an ill conscience sets such an enemy to rest. Aye, sir, there's blood foully shed in every step of it. But hark again, a little closer. Put your heart in your ears, Mr. Utterson, and tell me, is that the doctor's foot?
The steps fell lightly and oddly, with a certain swing, for all they went so slowly. It was different indeed from the heavy creaking tread of Henry Jekyll.
Is there ever anything else?
Once I heard it weeping.
Weeping? How that?
Weeping like a woman or a lost soul. I came away with that upon my heart, that I could have wept too.
But now the 10 minutes drew to an end. Poole disinterred the axe from under a stack of packing straw. The candle was set upon the nearest table to light them to the attack, and they drew near with bated breath to where the patient foot was still going up and down, in the quiet of the night.
Jekyll, I demand to see you. I give you fair warning, our suspicions are aroused. I must and shall see you, if not by fair means, then by foul. If not of your consent, then by brute force.
Utterson, for heaven's sake, have mercy!
Ah, that's not Jekyll's voice. It's Hyde's. Down with the door, Poole!
With a great effort, Poole swung the axe over her shoulder. The blow shook the building, and the red baize door leaped against the lock and hinges. A dismal screech, as of mere animal terror, rang from the cabinet. Up went the axe again, and again the panels crashed and shook the frame. 4 times the blow fell, but the wood was tough, and the fittings were of excellent workmanship, and it was not until the 5th that the lock burst in sunder, and the wreck of the door fell inwards on the carpet.
What the? No!
The besiegers stood back a little and peered in. There lay the cabinet before their eyes, and in the mist there lay the body of a man sorely contorted and still twitching. They drew near on tiptoe, turned it on its back, and beheld the face of Edward Hyde. He was dressed in clothes far too large for him, clothes of the doctor's bigness, the cords of his face still moving with a semblance of life. But the life was quite gone, and by the crushed vial in his hand and the strong smell of poison that hung upon the air, Utterson knew that he was looking on the body of a self-destroyer.
We have come too late, whether to save or to punish. Hyde has gone to his own account, and it only remains for us to find the body of your master.
Poole and Utterson searched all the rooms and recesses of the laboratory and house thoroughly. Each closet needed but a glance, for all were empty, and all, by the dust that fell from their doors, had stood long unopened. Nowhere was there any trace of Henry Jekyll, dead or alive. Poole stamped on the flagstones of the corridor.
He must be buried here.
Or he may have fled.
Utterson turned to examine the door in the by-street. It was locked, and lying nearby on the flagstones, they found the key, already stained with rust.
This does not look like it's been used in a while.
In a while? Do you not see, sir, it is broken, much as if a man had stomped on it.
Aye, and the fractures too are rusty. This is beyond me, Poole. Let us go back to the cabinet.
They mounted the stairs in silence, and still, with an occasional awestruck glance at the dead body, proceeded more thoroughly to examine the contents of the cabinet. At one table there were traces of chemical work, various measured heaps of some white salt being laid on glass saucers, as though for an experiment in which the unhappy man had been prevented.
That is the same drug that I was always bringing him.
Even as she spoke, the kettle with a startling noise boiled over. This brought them to the fireside, where the easy chair was drawn cosily up, and the tea-things stood ready to the sitter's elbow, the very sugar in the cup. There were several books on a shelf. One lay open beside the tea-things, and Utterson was amazed to find that it was a copy of a pious work, for which Jekyll had several times expressed a great esteem, and annotated, in his own hand, with startling blasphemies. Next, the searchers came to the looking-glass, into whose depths they looked with an involuntary horror. But it was so turned as to show them nothing but the rosy glow playing on the roof, and their own pale and fearful faces, stooping
This
to look
glass
in.
has seen some strange things, sir.
And surely none stranger than itself. For what could Jekyll want with it?
You may say that indeed.
Next, they turned to the business table. On the desk among the neat array of papers, a large envelope was uppermost, and bore in the doctor's hand the name of Mr. Utterson. The lawyer unsealed it, and several enclosures fell to the floor. The first was a will, drawn in the same eccentric terms as the one which Utterson had returned 6 months before to serve as a testament in case of death, and as a deed of gift in case of disappearance. But, in place of the name Edward Hyde, the lawyer, with such indescribable amazement, read the name of Gabriel James Utterson. He looked at Poole, and then back at the paper, and last of all at the dead Hyde stretched upon the carpet.
My head goes round. Even though Hyde had this will in his possession all of these days, while he had no cause to like me, and while he must have raged to see himself displaced, but yet he did not destroy this document.
He picked up the next paper. It was a brief note in the doctor's hand and dated at the top.
Oh, Poole! He was alive and here this day! He cannot have been disposed of in so short of time. He must still be alive. He must have fled. And then, why fled? And how? And in that case, can we venture to declare this suicide? Oh, we must be careful. I foresee that we may yet involve your master in some dire catastrophe.
Why don't you read that paper, sir?
Because I fear. God grant I have no cause for it.
And with that he brought the paper to his eyes, and it read as follows.
My dear Utterson, when this shall fall into your hands, I shall have disappeared. Under what circumstances, I have not the power to foresee. But my instinct and all the circumstances of my nameless situation tell me that the end is sure and must be early. Go then, and first read the narrative which Dr. Lanyon warned me he was to place in your hands, and if you care to hear more, turn to the confession of your unworthy and unhappy friend, Henry Jekyll.
There was a third enclosure?
Here it is, sir.
Poole gave to Utterson a considerable packet, sealed in several places. The lawyer put it in his pocket.
I would say nothing of this paper. If your master has fled or is dead, we may at least save his credit. It is now 10. I must go home and read these documents in quiet, but I shall be back before midnight, when we shall send for the police.
They went out, locking the door of the laboratory behind them. And Utterson, once more leaving the servants gathered about the fire in the hall, trudged back to his office to read the two narratives in which this mystery was now to be explained. Chapter 9. Dr. Lanyon's Narrative.
On the 9th of January, now 4 days ago, I received by the evening delivery a registered envelope, addressed in the hand of my colleague and old school companion, Henry Jekyll. I was a good deal surprised by this, for we were by no means in the habit of correspondence. I had seen the man, dined with him indeed, the night before the letter came, and I could imagine nothing in our intercourse that should justify formality of registration. The contents increased my wonder, for this is how the letter ran.
10th December, 1886. Dear Lanyon, you are one of my oldest friends, and although we may have differed at times on scientific questions, I cannot remember, at least on my side, any break in our affection. There was never a day when if you had said to me, Jekyll, my life, my honor, my reason depend upon you, I would have sacrificed my left hand to help you. Lanyon, my life, my honor, my reason are all at your mercy. If you fail me tonight, I am lost. You might suppose after this preface that I am going to ask you for something dishonorable to grant. Judge for yourself. I want you to postpone all other engagements for tonight. Even if you are summoned to the bedside of an emperor, to take a cab, unless your carriage should be actually at the door, and with this letter in your hand for consultation, to drive straight to my house. Poole, my butler, has her orders. You will find her awaiting your arrival with a locksmith. The door of my cabinet is then to be forced, and you are to go in alone. To open the glazed press, letter E, on the left hand, breaking the lock if it be shut, and to draw it out, with all its contents as they stand, the fourth drawer from the top, or the third from the bottom. In my extreme distress of mind, I have the morbid fear of misdirecting you, but even if I am in error, you may know the right drawer by its contents, some powders, a vial, and a paper book. This drawer I beg of you to carry back with you to Cavendish Square, exactly as it stands. That is the first part of my service. Now for the second. You should be back, if you set out at once on the receipt of this, long before midnight. But I will leave you that amount of margin, not only in the fear of one of those obstacles that can neither be prevented nor foreseen, but because an hour when your servants are in bed is to be preferred for what will be remaining to do. At midnight, then, I have to ask you to be alone in your consulting room, to admit with your own hand into the house a man who will present himself in my name, and to place in his hands the drawer which you have brought with you from my cabinet. Then you will have played your part and earned my gratitude completely. 5 minutes afterwards, if you insist upon an explanation, you will have understood that these arrangements are of capital importance, and that by the neglect of even one of them, fantastic as they might appear, you might have charged your conscience with my death, or the shipwreck of my reason. Confident as I am that you will not trifle with this appeal, my heart sinks and my hand trembles at the bare thought of such a possibility. Think of me at this hour in a strange place, labouring under a blackness of distress that no fancy can exaggerate, and yet well aware, if you will be but punctual with me, my troubles will roll away like a story that is told. Serve me, my dear Lanyon, and save your friend, H.J. P.S. I had already sealed this up when a fresh terror struck upon my soul. It is possible that the post office may fail me, and this letter not come into your hands until tomorrow morning. In that case, dear Lanyon, do my errand when it shall be most convenient for you in the course of the day, and once more expect my messenger at midnight. It may then already be too late, and if a night passes without event, you will know that you have seen the last of Henry Jekyll.
Upon the reading of this letter, I was sure my colleague was insane, but till that was proved beyond the possibility of a doubt, I felt bound to do as he requested. The less I understood of this conundrum, the less I was in a position to judge of its importance, and an appeal so worded could not be set aside without a grave responsibility. I rose accordingly from my table, got into a hansom, and drove straight to Jekyll's house. The butler was awaiting my arrival. She had received by the same post as mine a registrated letter of instruction, and had sent out once for a locksmith and a carpenter. The tradesmen came while we were yet speaking, and we moved in a body to old Dr. Denman's surgical theatre, from which, as you are doubtlessly aware, Jekyll's private cabinet is most conveniently entered. The door was very strong, the lock excellent. The carpenter avowed that he would have great trouble and have to do much damage, if force were to be used, and the locksmith was near despair. But this last was a handy fellow, and after 2 hours' work, the door stood open. The press marked E was unlocked, and I took out the drawer and had it filled with straw and tied in a sheet, and returned with it to Cavendish Square. Here I proceeded to examine its contents. The powders were neatly enough made up, but not with the nicety of the dispensing chemist, so that it was plain that they were of Jekyll's private manufacture. And when I opened one of the wrappers, I found what seemed to me a simple crystalline salt of white colour. The vial, to which I next turned my attention, might have been about half full of a blood-red liquor, which was highly pungent to the sense of smell, and seemed to me to contain a phosphorus and some volatile ether. As to the other ingredients, I could make no guess. The book was an ordinary version book, and contained little but a series of dates. These covered a period of many years, but I observed that the entry ceased nearly a year ago, and quite abruptly. Here and there a brief remark was attached to a date, usually no more than a single word, double occurring perhaps 6 times in a total of several hundred entries, and once very early in the list, and followed by several marks of exclamation. Total failure? All this, though it piqued my curiosity, told me little of that was definite. Here were a vial of some tincture, a paper of some salt, and the record of a series of experiments that had led, like many of Jekyll's other investigations, to no end of practical usefulness. How could the presence of these articles in my house affect either the honour, the sanity, or the life of my flighty colleague? If his messenger could go to one place, why could he not go to another? And even granting some impediment, why was this gentleman to be received by me in secret? The more I reflected, the more convinced I grew that I was dealing with a case of cerebral disease. And though I dismissed my servants to bed, I loaded an old revolver, that I might be found in some posture of self-defense. 12 o'clock had scarce rung out over London, ere the knocker sounded very gently on the door. I went myself at the summons, and found a small man crouching against the pillars of the portico. "Do you come from Dr. Jekyll?" I asked.
Yes.
When I had bidden him enter, he did not obey me without a searching backwards glance into the darkness of the square. There was a policeman not far off, advancing with his bull's-eye open, and at the sight I thought my visitor started and made great haste. These particulars struck me, I confess, disagreeably, and as I followed him into the bright light of the consulting room, I kept my hand ready on my weapon. Here, at last, I had a chance of clearly seeing him. I had never set eyes on him before, so much was certain. He was small, as I have said. I was struck, besides, with the shocking expression of his face. With his remarkable combination of great muscular activity and great apparent debility of constitution, and, last but not least, with the odd, subjective disturbance caused by his neighborhood. This bore some resemblance to incipient rigor, and was accompanied by marked sinking of the pulse. At the time, I set it down to some idiosyncratic personal distaste, and merely wondered at the acuteness of the symptoms. But I have since had the reason to believe the cause to lie much deeper in the nature of man, and to turn on some nobler hinge than the principle of hatred. This person, who had thus, from the first moment of his entrance, struck in me what I can only describe as disgustful curiosity. He was dressed in a fashion that would have made an ordinary person laughable. His clothes, that is to say, although they were of rich and sober fabric, were enormously too large for him in every measurement. The trousers hanging on his legs and rolled up to keep them from the ground, the waist of his coat below his haunches, and the collar sprawling wide upon his shoulders. Strange to relate, this ludicrous attire was far from moving me to laughter. Rather, as there was something abnormal and misbegotten in the very essence of the creature that now faced me, something seizing, surprising, and revolting. This fresh disparity seemed to but fit in and to reinforce it, so that, to my interest in the man's nature and character, there was an added curiosity as to his origin, his life, his fortune and status in the world. These observations, though they have taken so great a space to be set down in, were yet the work of a few seconds. My visitor, indeed, was on fire with sombre excitement.
Have you got it? Have you got it?
And so lively was his impatience that he even laid his hand upon my arm and sought to shake me. I put him back, conscious at his touch of a certain icy pang along my blood. "Come, sir," said I, "you forget that I have not yet the pleasure of your acquaintance. Be seated, if you please." And I showed him an example, and sat down myself in the customary seat, and with as a fair imitation of my ordinary manner to the patient as the lateness of the hour, the nature of my preoccupations, and the horror I had of my visitor, would suffer me to muster.
I beg your pardon, Dr. Lanyon. What you say is very well founded, and my impatience has shown its heels to my politeness. I come here at the insistence of your colleague, Dr. Henry Jekyll, on a piece of business of some moment, and I understood...
He paused and put his hand to his throat, and I could see, in spite of his collected manner, that he was wrestling against the approaches of hysteria.
I understood a draw...
But here I took pity on my visitor's suspense, and some perhaps on my growing curiosity. "There it is, sir," said I, pointing to the drawer where it lay on the floor behind the table and still covered with the sheet. He sprang to it, and then paused, and laid his hand upon his heart. I could hear his teeth grate with the convulsive action of his jaws. And his face was so ghastly to see that I grew alarmed for both his life and reason. "Compose yourself," said I. He turned a dreadful smile to me, and as if the decision of despair plucked away the sheet, At the sight of the contents, he uttered one loud sob of such immense relief that I sat petrified. And the next moment, in a voice that was already fairly well under control,
"Have you a graduated glass?"
I rose from my place with something of an effort and gave him what he asked. He thanked me with a smiling nod, measured out a few minims of the red tincture, and added one of the powders. The mixture, which was at first a reddish hue, began in proportion as the crystals melted, to brighten in colour, to fizz audibly, and to throw off small fumes of vapour. Suddenly, and at the same moment, the fizzing ceased, and the compounds changed to a dark purple, which faded again more slowly to a watery green. My visitor, who had watched these metamorphoses with a keen eye, smiled, set down the glass upon the table, and then turned and looked upon me with an air of scrutiny.
"And now to settle what remains. Will you be wise? Will you be guided? Will you suffer me to take this glass in my hand and to go forth from your house without further parley? Or has the greed of curiosity too much command of you? Think before you answer, for it shall be done as you decide. As you decide, you shall be left as you were before, and neither richer nor wiser, unless the sense of service rendered to a man in mortal distress may be counted as a kind of riches of the soul, or, if you shall prefer to choose, a new province of knowledge and new avenues to fame and power shall be laid open to you, here, in this room, upon the instant, and your sight shall be blasted by a prodigy to stagger the unbelief of Satan."
"Sir, you speak in enigmas, and you will perhaps not wonder that I hear you with no very strong impression of belief. But I have gone too far in the way of inexplicable services to pause before I see the end."
"It is well, Lanyon. You remember your vows. What follows is under the seal of our profession. And now, you who have so long been bound to the most narrow and material views, you who have denied the virtue of transcendental medicine, you who have derided your superiors, behold!"
He put the glass to his lips and drank at one gulp. A cry followed. He reeled, he staggered, clutched at the table, and held on, staring with injected eyes, gasping with mouth open. And as I looked, there came, I thought, a change. He seemed to swell. His face became suddenly black, and the features seemed to melt and alter. And the next moment, I had sprung to my feet and leaped back against the wall, my arms raised to shield me from what the prodigy, and my mind submerged in terror. Oh God, again and again! For there before my eyes, pale and shaking, and half fainting, and groping before him with his hands, like a man restored from death, there stood Henry Jekyll. What he told me in the next hour, I cannot bring my mind to set on paper. I saw what I saw, and I heard what I heard, and my soul is sickened at it. And yet now that sight has faded from my eyes. I ask myself if I believe it, and I cannot answer. My life is shaken to its roots. Sleep has left me. The deadliest terror sits by me at all hours of the day and night. I feel that my days are numbered, and that I must die. And yet I shall die incredulously. As for the moral turpitude that man unveiled to me, even in tears of penitence, I cannot, even in memory, dwell on it without a start of horror. I will say but one thing. Utterson, and that, if you can bring your mind to credit it, will be more than enough. The creature who crept into my house that night was, on Jekyll's own confession, known by the name of Hyde, and hunted for in every corner of the land as the murderer of Carew, Hasty Lanyon.
Thank you for listening to Episode 2 of Lancaster Bible College's radio adaptation of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Tonight's dramatic reading was presented by Isaac Zimmerman as Jekyll and Hyde, Nate Odie as the narrator, Seth Jarabek as Mr. Utterson, Caleb Nelson as Dr. Lanyon, Abigail Simile as Poole, and cameos from Dr. Michael Freeman as the servant and cook. This performance is brought to you by Debbie Celeste, Faith Delegati, Noah Lynch, Kate Seipel, Juliet Tsai, and Addie Winfrey. All music and sound effects were produced by Corey Rosen. Tune in tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. for the third and final part of the story.